The December wind howled through the bare cottonwood trees outside the McAllister farmhouse, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers demanding entry. Annie McAllister pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the pane as she traced patterns in the condensation. 24 years old and still unmarried, a spinster by frontier standards, she had long accepted her role as the invisible daughter, the one who kept house while her younger sister Eleanor basked in the glow of their parents' pride. "Annie, stop your daydreaming and come here at once," her mother's sharp voice cut through the drafty hallway like a whip crack. Annie sighed, smoothing down her plain brown dress, a hand-me-down from Eleanor, naturally, and made her way to the parlor. The room, despite its modest furnishings, held an air of grave importance. Her parents sat rigidly in their chairs, faces drawn with a kind of tension that preceded either very good or very bad news. Eleanor stood by the fireplace, her perfect golden curls catching the light, her rosebud lips pursed in defiance. "Sit down, Annie," her father commanded, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. Thomas McAllister had fought in the Mexican War and carried himself with military bearing even in civilian life. "We have a family matter to discuss." Annie perched on the edge of the worn settee, her hands folded in her lap. She had learned long ago that silence served her better than questions. "Your sister," her mother began, shooting Eleanor a look that could freeze the Missouri River in July, "has refused Mr. Jesse Hartland's proposal of marriage." Annie's eyes widened slightly. Jesse Hartland, she knew the name from months of dinner conversation. A successful rancher from Wyoming Territory, a man of considerable means who had courted Eleanor through letters after meeting her briefly at a church social in St. Louis. Their correspondence had been the talk of the household, with Eleanor reading choice passages aloud at dinner, her voice dripping with amusement at his earnest declarations. "I will not marry a man I barely know," Eleanor declared, tossing her head. "I don't care how many cattle he owns or how poetic his letters are. I'm in love with William Morrison, and that's final." "William Morrison is a store clerk with no prospects," their father thundered. "Jesse Hartland offers you security, land, a future. He offers me exile to some God-forsaken ranch in the wilderness." Eleanor shot back. "I won't do it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Annie watched as her parents exchanged meaningful glances, conducting one of those wordless conversations that came from 30 years of marriage. Her stomach began to knot as she sensed the tide turning in her direction. "Annie," her mother said slowly, her voice taking on a calculating tone that made Annie's skin prickle. "You've always been our dutiful daughter." And there it was, the trap springing shut before Annie even realized she'd stepped into it. "No." The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. "I beg your pardon." Her father's eyebrows rose to his hairline. "I said no," Annie repeated, finding her voice. "You cannot seriously be suggesting that I pretend to be Eleanor and marry this man." "Not pretend," her mother corrected smoothly. "Simply take her place. Mr. Hartland has only met Eleanor once, briefly. The correspondence has been through letters. Your sisters, there's a family resemblance." Annie almost laughed at the absurdity. Where Eleanor was golden sunshine, Annie was autumn earth. Where Eleanor had curves that turned heads, Annie was built like a fence post, sturdy and unremarkable. Their only similarity was the McAllister stubborn streak, though Annie had learned to hide hers better. "This is madness," Annie said quietly. "This is necessity," her father countered. "We've already accepted his proposal on Eleanor's behalf. We've taken his money for her trousseau. The McAllister name still means something in this county, and I'll not have it tarnished by a broken engagement." "Then give him his money back." "We can't." Her mother's admission hung in the air like smoke. "It's been spent. The mortgage payment, the new plow, seed for spring planting." Annie felt the room spin slightly. They had spent the man's money already, counting on a wedding that would never happen. The weight of her family's honor and their financial survival suddenly pressed down on her shoulders like a yoke. "He's a good man," her mother pressed on, sensing Annie's weakening resolve. "His letters speak of loneliness, of wanting a true companion. You could do worse. Annie, at your age, with your modest prospects." The unspoken words hung in the air. "You're 24, plain, and no one else is asking." Annie stood abruptly, needing to move, to think. She paced to the window, staring out at the barren fields that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Wyoming territory, wild and unknown, and somewhere there, a man named Jesse Hartland waited for a bride who would never come. Unless... "I'll need to tell him the truth when I arrive," Annie said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I won't start a marriage with a lie." "Annie, no," her mother began, but Annie cut her off. "Those are my terms. I'll go to Wyoming. I'll meet Mr. Hartland, but I'll tell him immediately that I'm not Eleanor. If he still wants to marry me, Annie, not some fantasy of Eleanor, then we'll proceed. If not, I'll find work in Wyoming and repay his money myself. Every penny." Her father's face darkened. "You'll do no such thing. You'll marry him and be grateful for the opportunity. Then find another daughter to send," Annie replied, surprising herself with her firmness. "Because those are my only terms." Eleanor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Annie's right. She deserves that much honesty. It's her life you're bartering with." Their parents exchanged another of those long looks. "Finally," their mother sighed. "Very well. But Annie, you must understand, if he rejects you, you cannot come home. We cannot afford another mouth to feed, not with the scandal it would bring." The words stung, but Annie had expected nothing less. She had always been the spare daughter, the insurance policy. Now she was being cashed in to save the family's reputation. "I understand," she said quietly. "When do I leave?" "The stage comes through on Thursday. That gives us 3 days to prepare your trunk and coach you on what Eleanor has told him in her letters." Annie almost laughed at the irony. She was to study her sister's lies in order to tell the truth. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparations. Her mother pulled out Eleanor's correspondence with Jesse Hartland, and Annie forced herself to read the letters her sister had found so amusing. But where Eleanor had seen overwrought prose, Annie found something else entirely: loneliness, genuine feeling. A man trying too hard, perhaps, but trying nonetheless. "The sunset here paints the mountains purple and gold." Asterisk one letter read, "I find myself wishing I had someone to share such sights with, someone who could appreciate the terrible beauty of this untamed land. I hope, Miss McAllister, that you might be that someone." Asterisk. Annie traced the words with her finger, wondering what kind of man wrote such things. Eleanor's responses, which her mother had insisted on reviewing before sending, were full of practiced charm and coquettish evasions. Annie felt a pang of sympathy for Jesse Hartland, who had poured his heart out to a woman who had mocked him at every turn. Her trunk was a patchwork of necessities and hand-me-downs. 2 of Eleanor's plainer dresses, taken in to fit Annie's slighter frame, a warm cloak that had been their grandmother's, sturdy boots that had seen better days but would have to suffice. Her mother packed a small bag of peppermint candies for the journey. She said, not meeting Annie's eyes, it was the closest to affection she would show. Eleanor surprised her the night before departure, slipping into Annie's room as she finished her packing. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said simply, perching on the bed. "This isn't right, what they're asking of you." "What's right rarely matters in this family," Annie replied, folding a patched petticoat. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then reached into her pocket. "Here," she said, pressing something into Annie's hand. "I was going to throw these away, but maybe you should have them." Annie looked down at the bundle of letters tied with ribbon, Jesse Hartland's letters. All of them. He's not a bad man, Eleanor admitted. Just not for me. But Annie, you don't have to be me. Be yourself. If he's any kind of decent man, he'll see what I was too blind to notice. And what's that? Eleanor smiled sadly. That you're worth 10 of me when it comes to the things that actually matter. The morning of departure dawned gray and bitter cold. Annie stood on the porch in her traveling clothes, her trunk already loaded on the wagon that would take her to town to catch the stage. Her family assembled to see her off, though she suspected it was more to ensure she actually left than out of sentiment. Her father pressed a small purse into her hand. "For emergencies," he said gruffly. "Don't shame us, Annie." Her mother adjusted Annie's bonnet with nervous fingers. "Remember what we discussed. Be demure, be proper, be Eleanor," Annie finished. "I've already told you, Mother, I'll be myself or nothing at all." Her mother's lips thinned, but she said nothing more. Eleanor hugged her, whispering, "Write to me. Let me know you're safe." And then Annie was in the wagon, watching her childhood home grow smaller as they headed toward town. She clutched the small bag of peppermint candies in her lap, the letters hidden in her trunk, and tried not to think about the fact that she might never see this place again. The stage office in town was crowded with travelers, rough men heading west for gold or land or escape from whatever demons chased them. Annie felt very small and very alone as she waited for the stage to be readied. She had never been farther from home than St. Louis, and now she was heading into the territories, into the unknown. "Miss McAllister." She turned to find a kindly-faced older man in clerical clothing. "I'm Reverend Palmer," he said, tipping his hat. "I understand we'll be traveling companions as far as North Platte. Your father asked me to keep an eye on you." Annie managed to smile. Even now, her father was controlling her journey. "That's very kind of you, Reverend," she said. "Not at all. It's a hard journey for a young woman alone. Though I must say, you're very brave to be making it. Not many would answer the call of marriage into the frontier. Asterisk. If only you knew." Annie thought, but she merely nodded. The stage arrived in a clatter of wheels and horses, and suddenly it was time. Annie climbed aboard. Settling herself in the corner of the coach, Reverend Palmer took the seat across from her, and they were soon joined by a talkative woman named Mrs. Craddock, who seemed determined to extract Annie's entire life story before they'd even left town, and two rough-looking men who eyed Annie with an interest that made her pull her cloak tighter. As the stage lurched into motion, Annie caught one last glimpse of the familiar streets, the church steeple, the general store where Eleanor's beloved William probably stood behind the counter. Then they were past the town limits, heading west into the vast unknown. Mrs. Craddock proved to be a fountain of unsolicited advice. "Marriage in the territories is nothing like back east," she proclaimed, her voice cutting through the rumble of wheels. "It's partnership or perishment out there. No room for delicate sensibilities or romantic notions. You prepared for that, dear?" Annie thought of Jessie Hartland's letters, full of sunsets and loneliness. "I suppose I'll have to be," she said. "That's the spirit. Too many young women come out here expecting civilization and comfort. They don't last, but you, Mrs. Craddock studied Annie with sharp eyes. "You've got the look of a survivor about you." Annie wasn't sure if that was a compliment, but she took it as one. The first day's journey took them through familiar farmland, but by the second day, the landscape began to change. The ordered fields gave way to prairie, vast and rolling under an endless sky. Annie had never seen so much emptiness, so much space. It was terrifying and exhilarating at once. At night, they stopped at way stations, rough buildings that offered basic meals and harder beds. Annie learned to sleep sitting up in the coach when the stations were full, learned to eat whatever was offered without complaint, learned to ignore the speculative looks of the men they encountered. Reverend Palmer proved a godsend, his presence deterring the worst of the unwanted attention. He was also a gifted storyteller, regaling them with tales of his missionary work among the Indian tribes. "They're not the savages the newspapers would have you believe," he said one evening as they waited for fresh horses. "They're people, with their own ways and wisdom. The tragedy is how little we try to understand each other." It was a radical view, one that would have scandalized Annie's parents, but out here, under stars brighter than she'd ever seen, conventional thinking seemed to matter less. On the fourth day, trouble came. They had stopped at a particularly desolate station when the two rough men who'd been eyeing Annie made their move. She had stepped outside to use the primitive facilities when one of them blocked her path back to the station. Well, he drawled, whiskey heavy on his breath. Little mouse wandering far from her hole. Annie's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Please step aside." "Now what's your hurry? Maybe you'd like some company on your journey. Pretty thing like you shouldn't be traveling alone." "She's not alone." Reverend Palmer's voice came from behind the man. The minister might be old, but he stood straight and firm. "The lady is under my protection. You'll step aside now." For a moment, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Then the man's partner called from the station door. "Leave it, Jake! Stage driver's got a shotgun on us." Jake spat on the ground near Annie's feet but moved aside. "Another time, maybe," he muttered. Annie's knees shook as she made her way back to the coach, but she held her head high. Reverend Palmer walked beside her, a steady presence. "Thank you," she whispered. "You handled that well," he said. "Showed no fear. That's important out here. Fear is like blood in the water to such men." That night, Annie lay awake thinking about what lay ahead. If the journey was this dangerous, what would life be like on an isolated ranch? But then she remembered Jesse's letters, his longing for companionship, his dreams of building something lasting in the wilderness. Maybe, just maybe, she could be part of that dream. The landscape continued to change as they traveled west. The green of the prairie gave way to the browns and reds of more arid land. Mountains appeared on the horizon, snow-capped and impossibly tall. The air grew thinner, colder, despite the spring season. Mrs. Craddock left them at Fort Laramie, replaced by a taciturn trader and his Indian wife, who spoke no English but smiled shyly at Annie. The two rough men had disappeared at an earlier stop, much to Annie's relief. "Not much farther now," Reverend Palmer told her as they neared North Platte. "You'll take the spur line from there to Cheyenne, then north to your destination." Nervous, terrified, Annie admitted. He patted her hand paternally. "That's honest, but you know what I think you're going to do just fine. You've got grit. Miss McAllister, that counts for more than beauty or charm out here." As the stage rolled into North Platte, Annie touched the pocket where she kept Jesse's letters. Soon, very soon, she would meet the man who had written them. She would tell him the truth that she was not the golden Eleanor he expected, but plain, practical Annie, and then her real journey would begin. The stage pulled to a stop, and Annie gathered her courage like armor. Whatever came next, she would face it with truth and dignity. She was Annie McAllister, and she would not pretend to be anyone else. Even if it meant facing rejection, even if it meant starting over alone in this vast, wild land, she would not begin her new life with a lie. The change from the crowded stagecoach to the smaller, rougher conveyance that would take Annie from North Platte to Cheyenne felt like shedding one world for another. Gone were the relative comforts of the main stage line. This coach was little more than a wooden box on wheels, driven by a grizzled man who introduced himself simply as Dutch and seemed to consider conversation an unnecessary evil. Annie's new traveling companions consisted of a nervous banker named Mr. Harrison Wilde, clutching a leather case as if his life depended on it, and two cowboys who smelled of cattle and whiskey, but tipped their hats politely when she boarded. The absence of Reverend Palmer's protective presence made her feel exposed, vulnerable, but she lifted her chin and took her seat without showing her apprehension. First time heading into Wyoming territory. Miss, one of the cowboys asked. He was younger than his companion, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. Yes, Annie replied, seeing no point in dissembling. Name's Samuel Grant, he said, though everyone calls me Sam. This here's my partner, William Sherman. We're heading back to the Boxar after delivering cattle to the railroad. Annie nodded politely. Annie McAllister. I'm meeting someone in Laramie. Sam's eyes showed understanding. Mail-order bride situation. Heat flooded Annie's cheeks, but she nodded. There was no shame in it, she told herself. Many women came west this way. Nothing wrong with that, Sam said quickly, seeing her embarrassment. My own sister came out from Ohio that way, married a good man, got a fine spread near Medicine Bow. It's honest work, building a home out here. His words were kindly meant, and Annie felt some of her tension ease. Thank you, that's reassuring to hear. The older cowboy, William, spoke up. What's your intended's name? Might be we know him. Jesse Hartland, Annie said, watching their faces for any reaction. The two cowboys exchanged glances. Hartland, William said slowly. Runs cattle northwest of Laramie. Good land up there, if a bit isolated. You know him? Annie asked eagerly. Know of him. Sam corrected. Keeps to himself mostly. Came out after the war, like a lot of folks. Built his place from nothing. They say, solid reputation. Fair dealer. Your young man doesn't cheat at cards or brands, which is more than you can say for some. It wasn't much, but it was more than Annie had known before. She filed the information away, adding it to the portrait she'd built from Jesse's letters. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days through landscape that grew progressively more desolate. The mountains loomed closer now, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised snow despite the lateness of spring. The coach lurched and bounced over roads that were little more than wagon tracks, throwing the passengers against each other with bone-jarring regularity. At one point, Dutch pulled the coach to an abrupt halt, reaching for the rifle beside him. Annie's heart leaped to her throat as she peered out the window, expecting bandits or Indians. Instead, she saw a herd of antelope streaming across their path, hundreds of them moving like a brown river across the sage-covered plain. Beautiful, she breathed, momentarily forgetting her fear. Sam grinned. Wait till you see your first buffalo herd, though they're getting scarcer now. Railroad's changing everything. As they continued on, Annie found herself studying the land that would be her new home. It was nothing like Missouri Wilder. Emptier, with a kind of terrible beauty that both frightened and fascinated her. The sky seemed impossibly vast, stretching from horizon to horizon without the comforting interruption of trees or buildings. She could understand why Jesse had written of loneliness here. This was a land that could swallow you whole if you let it. That night they stopped at a way station that made the previous ones look luxurious by comparison. It was little more than a soddy cut into a hillside, run by a toothless woman who served them beans that might have been edible a week ago and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Annie forced herself to eat, knowing she needed strength for what lay ahead. She slept fitfully on a bench in the main room, her cloak pulled tight around her, starting at every sound. The banker, Mr. Wild, snored prodigiously in the corner, apparently unbothered by their surroundings. The cowboys took turns keeping watch, a precaution that did nothing to ease Annie's nerves. The next morning brought a change in weather. Clouds had rolled in during the night, heavy and gray, bringing with them a cold wind that cut through Annie's cloak as if it were paper. Dutch eyed the sky with concern. Storm coming, he announced. We'll push hard for Cheyenne. Don't want to get caught in the open if it turns to snow. Snow. In May. But Annie had learned not to question the vagaries of frontier weather. She huddled in the coach as Dutch urged the horses to greater speed, the vehicle swaying dangerously on the rough road. The storm caught them 10 miles from Cheyenne. It started as rain, cold and driving, turning the road to mud within minutes. Then, as they climbed higher, the rain became sleet, then snow. The world outside the coach windows turned white, visibility dropping to mere feet. "Hold on," Dutch shouted from his perch, fighting to control the horses as they slipped and slid on the rapidly deteriorating road. Annie gripped the seat, her knuckles white, as the coach tilted at alarming angles. Beside her, Mr. Wild had gone green, clutching his case and muttering what sounded like prayers. The cowboys remained calm, but she could see the tension in their faces. Then it happened. The coach hit a hidden rut, tilted too far, and went over. Annie felt herself flying, weightless for a terrifying moment before impact. She landed hard against the side of the coach now, the floor pain shooting through her shoulder. Someone's boot caught her in the ribs, driving the breath from her lungs. Glass from the window showered down, and she instinctively covered her face. "Everyone alive," Sam's voice cut through the chaos. A chorus of groans answered him. Annie tested her limbs, relieved to find everything still worked, though her shoulder throbbed fiercely. "We need to get out," William said urgently. "Coach could shift." They helped each other climb out through the door, now pointing skyward. Annie accepted Sam's hand, gritting her teeth against the pain as he pulled her up and out into the storm. The world was white chaos. Snow drove horizontally, stinging exposed skin. The horses, miraculously still attached to the coach, stood trembling and wild-eyed. Dutch was already working to unhitch them, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Station's back 3 miles. He shouted over the wind. "Coach is done for. We'll have to ride in this." But Annie could see they had no choice. The coach lay on its side like a wounded animal, one wheel still spinning slowly. Their luggage was scattered across the snow, already beginning to disappear under the accumulating white. Sam and William quickly salvaged what they could: Annie's trunk, miraculously intact, the banker's precious case, essential supplies. They helped Annie onto one of the coach horses, Sam swinging up behind her to keep her steady. "Hold tight," he said in her ear. "It's going to be rough." Rough was an understatement. The horse struggled through deepening snow, following Dutch's lead as he picked their way back toward the station. Annie had never been so cold, so miserable. Her wet clothes froze to her body. Her hands went numb despite her gloves, and she could no longer feel her feet. Just when she thought she couldn't endure another moment, buildings loomed out of the white. The station, a cluster of log structures that looked like paradise in that moment. Dutch pounded on the door, and blessed warmth spilled out as it opened. They stumbled inside. A sorry group of half-frozen travelers. The station keeper, a burly man named Theodore Roosevelt, though he went by Teddy, but took charge immediately. "Get them by the fire," he ordered his wife, a sturdy woman who took one look at Annie and whisked her away to a back room. "Out of those wet things," she commanded, already pulling blankets from a chest. "You'll catch your death otherwise." Annie's frozen fingers couldn't manage the buttons, so Mrs. Roosevelt helped her, tisking over the bruises already forming on Annie's shoulder and ribs. She wrapped Annie in dry blankets and led her back to the main room, where a roaring fire promised restoration. The men were already gathered around it, steaming like wet dogs. Sam had a cut on his cheek Annie hadn't noticed before, and Dutch was having his head wound tended by Teddy himself. "Lucky," Teddy pronounced. "Could have been much worse. You'll have to stay until the storm passes. Could be days." Days. Annie closed her eyes, thinking of Jesse waiting for her in Laramie. Would he think she'd changed her mind? Would he give up and return to his ranch? "I need to send word to Laramie," she said, "to let someone know I've been delayed." Teddy shook his head. "No one's going anywhere in this. Telegraph lines are probably down too. Your fellow will just have to be patient." Annie accepted a cup of hot coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around it for warmth. Her trunk sat in the corner, water-stained but intact. At least she still had her few possessions, including Jesse's letters. The storm raged for 2 days, 2 days of enforced closeness with strangers, of card games and stories around the fire, of simple meals and simpler accommodations. Annie helped Mrs. Roosevelt with cooking and mending, grateful for the activity. The men passed time with poker and tall tales, the banker loosening up enough to share stories of San Francisco before the gold rush tamed it. Sam proved especially kind, checking on Annie frequently, making sure she had what she needed. On the second night, as the wind finally began to die, he sat beside her by the fire. "Nervous about meeting your intended?" he asked gently. Annie nodded. "More than I expected, especially now, arriving days late. Looking like—" She gestured at herself, bruised, travel-worn. Nothing like the bride Jesse might be expecting. "Any man worth having won't care about that," Sam said firmly. "He'll see you survived a coach wreck and a blizzard to get to him. That says more than a pretty dress ever could." His words warmed Annie more than the fire. "Thank you. You've been very kind." Sam ducked his head. "Just being neighborly. Truth is—" He paused, then continued in a rush. "Truth is, if you find Heartland isn't to your liking, the Boxar could use a woman's touch. I mean, if you needed other options." Annie felt heat flood her cheeks. It was the closest thing to a proposal she'd ever received, delivered with stammering sincerity by a man she'd known 3 days. The frontier certainly moved at a different pace than Missouri. "That's very generous," she managed. "But I made a commitment." "Of course," Sam said quickly. "Just wanted you to know you got friends out here. Options. You're not alone." The conversation stayed with Annie through the night. Options. Friends. The words were foreign to someone used to being the invisible daughter, the one with no choices. Perhaps this wild land might offer more than just survival. The third morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having blown itself out. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sun. It was beautiful and terrible, at once a reminder of how quickly nature could turn deadly out here. Teddy organized a rescue party to retrieve what they could from the wrecked coach and to break a path to Cheyenne. It took most of the day, but by evening they had a route passable by horseback. "Stage line will send another coach in a day or two," Teddy informed them. "But if you're in a hurry, you can ride to Cheyenne tomorrow. From there, you might catch the freight wagons heading north." Annie chose to ride. She'd lost too much time already. Sam and William offered to escort her. As they were heading that direction anyway, Mr. Wilde elected to wait for proper transportation, still clutching his case as if it contained the crown jewels. The ride to Cheyenne was cold but manageable, the horses picking their way carefully through the snow. Annie rode behind Sam again, grateful for his steady presence. The mountains stood out sharp and clear against the blue sky, closer than ever. Somewhere among those peaks, Jesse waited. Cheyenne appeared like a mirage, a real town, with real buildings and real streets, though muddy and rough compared to anything back east. The cowboys saw her safely to a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mary Todd. "You take care now," Sam said as they prepared to leave. "Remember what I said, you've got friends out here?" William tipped his hat. "Heartland's a lucky man. Don't let him forget it." And then they were gone, riding off toward their ranch, leaving Annie alone again, but somehow less lonely than before. Mary Todd proved to be a godsend, a motherly woman who took one look at Annie's bruised face and insisted on doctoring her properly. "Coach wreck in a blizzard," she said, shaking her head. "You're lucky to be alive, child. When are you expected in Laramie?" 3 days ago, Annie admitted. "Well then, we'd best get you there quick. There's a freight wagon heading that way tomorrow. Not comfortable, but reliable. I know the driver, he'll see you safe." That night, Annie lay in a real bed for the first time in over a week, listening to the sounds of Cheyenne through her window. Somewhere out there, perhaps already heading this way. Jessie might be looking for her. Tomorrow, she would complete her journey. Tomorrow, she would tell him the truth. She pulled out his letters, reading them by lamplight one more time. The man who had written these words, would he be disappointed when plain Annie stood before him instead of golden Eleanor? Would he send her away? Annie touched her bruised cheek, thinking of Sam's words. She had survived a coach wreck and a blizzard. She had traveled across half a continent alone. Perhaps she was stronger than she'd known. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, she would rest, gathering strength for the final miles and the confrontation that awaited her. Whatever happened, she would face it with honesty and dignity. The mountains watched through her window, silent and eternal, keeping their secrets. Soon, she would be among them, starting a new life or facing rejection. Either way, she was no longer the invisible daughter waiting for life to happen to her. She was Annie McAllister, survivor of storms, and she would meet her fate head-on. The freight wagon lurched into Laramie just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains. Annie's bones ached from the jarring ride, her backside numb from sitting on wooden planks between crates of supplies. The driver, a taciturn man named Ulysses Grant, had barely spoken 10 words during the day-long journey, but he'd been as good as Mary Todd's word delivering her safely to her destination. "Laramie House is the best hotel," he said, helping her down from the wagon. "That is, if you're staying in town." Annie's throat went dry. She was here, after weeks of travel, delays, and near disaster. She had finally reached the place where Jessie Hartland waited. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her travel-worn dress, one of Eleanor's that had survived the coach wreck, though it bore water stains and signs of hardware. "Thank you," she managed. Yes, I suppose I should take a room first." Grant studied her with knowing eyes. "Meeting someone?" "Yes." He nodded, lifting her trunk down. "Well, miss, whatever happens, you made it this far. That counts for something." The Laramie House stood 2 stories tall, a beacon of civilization in what was otherwise a rough frontier town. Annie entered the lobby. Acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, the clerk, a young man with pomaded hair, looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "I need a room," Annie said, lifting her chin. "Just for tonight." "That'll be $2, in advance." Highway robbery. But Annie paid without complaint. She needed somewhere to clean up, to gather her courage before seeking out Jessie. The clerk handed her a key with obvious reluctance. "Room 8, upstairs. No visitors after 9 o'clock. The implication stung. But Annie ignored it. Let him think what he would. She had more important concerns. The room was small but clean, with a real bed, a washstand, and a small mirror. Annie stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing herself. The journey had carved new lines around her eyes, and the fading bruise on her cheek had turned yellow-green. Her hair, once neatly pinned, hung in limp strands. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had traveled too far through too much hardship. Working quickly, Annie heated water and washed as best she could. She changed into her best dress, another of Eleanor's, a deep blue wool that brought out what little color remained in her cheeks. She repinned her hair, wincing as she lifted her arms. Her shoulders still ached from the coach accident. From her trunk, she pulled out Jessie's letters, holding them like talismans. Then, on impulse, she grabbed the small bag of peppermint candies her mother had packed. One piece of home to carry with her into the unknown. The hotel clerk directed her to Jessie's usual stopping place, when in town, the Cattlemen's Association building. Though he might have given up and gone home by now. The clerk added with a smirk. "He's been waiting near a week." A week. Jessie had been waiting a week. The thought both warmed and terrified her. The Cattlemen's Association was a square building of raw lumber, functional rather than decorative. Annie paused outside, her heart hammering. Through the window, she could see men gathered around tables. smoking and talking. Which one was Jesse? Would she recognize him from Eleanor's brief description, tall, dark, serious-looking? Taking a deep breath, Annie pushed open the door. The conversation died as every head turned toward her. A woman entering this male domain was clearly an event. Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but held her ground. "I'm looking for Mr. Jesse Hartland," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. A man at the back of the room stood slowly. Annie's first thought was that Eleanor had vastly understated the case. Jesse Hartland wasn't just tall, he towered over most of the other men. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, tied back with a leather cord. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, white against sun-bronzed skin. But it was his eyes that caught her gray as winter storm clouds, holding a wariness that spoke of too many disappointments. "I'm Hartland," he said, his voice deep and carefully neutral. "Miss McAllister." This was it, the moment of truth. Annie could lie, could pretend to be Eleanor for just a little longer, but she'd come too far for deception. "Mr. Hartland," she began, aware of their audience. "Might we speak privately?" Something flickered in those gray eyes. Surprise, concern. He nodded, grabbing his hat from the table. "There's a parlor next door, ma'am." Annie followed him out, feeling the weight of curious stares. The parlor proved to be a small restaurant attached to the building, mostly empty at this hour. Jesse guided her to a corner table, pulling out her chair with unexpected courtesy. They sat facing each other, the silence stretching taut between them. Annie studied his face, seeing the marks of hardship etched there. This was a man who had known pain, who had built walls against the world. What was she about to do to him? "Mr. Hartland," she began, then stopped, gathering courage. "I need to tell you something. I'm not who you think I am." His expression didn't change, but his hands, resting on the table, tensed slightly. "Explain." "My name is Annie McAllister. I'm Eleanor's sister, her older sister." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Eleanor refused your proposal. She's in love with someone else, my parents. They had already spent the money you sent, couldn't return it. They insisted someone had to come, had to marry you to save the family's honor. So they sent me instead." The silence that followed felt eternal. Jesse's face had gone very still, carved from stone. Annie forced herself to continue. "I told them I would only come if I could tell you the truth immediately. I won't start a marriage with a lie. Mr. Hartland, if you want to send me back, I understand. I'll find work, pay back every penny you spent. But I couldn't pretend to be her." Jesse leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "You're not Eleanor." "No. The woman I've been writing to for 6 months. The woman who sent me a photograph. The woman I proposed to." Annie reached into her pocket, pulling out the bundle of letters. "These are yours, Eleanor. She shared them with the family. I've read them. Every word. The sunsets, the mountains, the loneliness. I know it's not the same as—" "Stop!" The word cracked like a whip. Jesse's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter. "Your family sent you as a replacement." The word stung, but it was accurate. "Yes, like ordering a horse and getting a mule instead." Annie flinched but met his gaze. "I suppose that's one way to look at it." Something shifted in his expression, surprised that she hadn't crumbled at the insult. He studied her more intently, taking in the water stains on her dress, the fading bruise on her cheek, the determined set of her jaw. "What happened to your face?" "Coach accident in the blizzard. We overturned coming into Cheyenne." His eyebrows rose. "The storm last week, you were caught in that?" "Yes, that's why I'm late. I'm sorry you had to wait." You traveled through that storm to get here to tell me you're not the woman I proposed to. Annie straightened. I traveled through that storm because I gave my word I would come. The truth-telling was my own condition. Jessie was quiet for a long moment, then called the waitress over. Coffee, and whatever hot food you have. I'm not hungry, Annie began. When did you last eat? She had to think. This morning, hardtack and jerky. Then you'll eat. It wasn't a request. The waitress brought coffee and bowls of stew. Annie wrapped her hands around the hot cup, inhaling the bitter aroma. Jessie hadn't sent her away. Not yet. Tell me, he said suddenly. Why did she refuse? Annie chose honesty. She's in love with a store clerk. Also, she found your letters. Overwhelming. The frontier doesn't appeal to her. Overwhelming. He repeated the word like he was tasting it. And you? What did you think of them? I thought... Annie paused, considering. I thought they were written by a lonely man trying very hard to be someone he thought would appeal to a woman he didn't really know. Jessie's eyes sharpened. That's perceptive. Also honest. Something we seem to value differently in my family. And yet here you are, telling me the truth at your own expense. Here I am. Annie agreed quietly. They ate in silence for a while. The stew was good, hot and filling, and Annie realized she'd been hungrier than she'd thought. Jessie watched her eat with an unreadable expression. How old are you? He asked. 24. Eleanor? 21. And they sent you because... Annie set down her spoon carefully. Because I'm the spare daughter, Mr. Hartland, the plain one, the one without prospects, the one who could be sacrificed to save the family honor without any great loss. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Jessie's expression shifted, something almost like recognition flickering in his eyes. I know something about being the spare, he said quietly. My older brother was supposed to inherit the family farm. I was supposed to go to seminary, be a minister. Then the war came. He didn't elaborate, but Annie could fill in the gaps. The brother who didn't come home. The second son thrust into a role he'd never wanted. The seminary student become soldier. Become rancher in a far country. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. It's just life. He paused. Your parents truly spent the money already. The mortgage, a new plow, seed. Annie felt shame heat her cheeks. They counted on the marriage happening. And if I send you back... They won't take me in. That was made clear. I'll find work somewhere. I can cook, clean, sew. I'll manage. Jessie studied her for a long moment. You came all this way, through all that hardship, just to tell me you're not your sister. I came because I had to. I stayed honest because that's who I am. Honest, he mused. That's a rare quality. The waitress cleared their bowls. Outside, evening was falling, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Annie thought of Jessie's letters describing such sunsets, wishing for someone to share them with. I should go, she said. Let you think about everything. I have a room at the Laramie house. I'll wait for your decision. My decision. Whether you want to send me back, or... She couldn't finish the sentence. Or marry you instead. His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. That seems presumptuous to even suggest. Jessie stood, moving to pull out her chair. As she rose, he stayed close, and Annie caught his scent leather and soap and something uniquely male that made her stomach flutter unexpectedly. I'll walk you back, he said. That's not necessary. It's dark. This isn't Missouri. Miss McAllister, let me walk you back. They left the restaurant together, stepping into the cool evening air. Laramie's streets were rough, full of puddles from melted snow. Jessie offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Annie took it. His arm was solid beneath her fingers. Steady. They walked in silence for a block before Jessie spoke. Why didn't you just pretend to be her? Would have been easier. Because I'm tired of being invisible, Annie said, surprising herself with the honesty. If someone is going to marry me or not marry me, I want it to be because of who I am, not who they think I am. And who are you? Annie considered the question. I'm Annie McAllister. I can milk a cow, birth a calf, and make bread from memory. I've read every book I could get my hands on, even if it meant reading by candlelight after everyone else was asleep. I'm not beautiful like Eleanor, but I'm strong. I can work from dawn to dusk and not complain. I get lonely too, Mr. Heartland. But I've learned to live with it, and I'm here, telling you the truth, even though it terrifies me. They'd reached the hotel. Jesse stopped, turning to face her. In the lamplight, his scar stood out white against his skin, and Annie had the absurd urge to trace it with her finger. The woman I wrote to, he said slowly. She told me she loved dancing and parties. She said she couldn't wait to bring culture and refinement to the frontier. Annie's heart sank. I'm sorry, I don't dance well, and I've been to exactly 3 parties in my life. As for refinement, she also said she was delicate, needed protection from life's harsh realities. I see. Do you... Jesse's eyes held an odd light. Because a delicate woman wouldn't have survived what you did to get here. A woman who loved parties wouldn't have come at all once she realized what she was heading into. Mr. Heartland. Jesse, he corrected. If we're being honest, might as well start there. Jesse, Annie repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. What are you saying? He looked up at the darkening sky, then back at her. I'm saying that maybe I've been writing to the wrong sister all along. I'm saying that I need to think, and you need to rest. Tomorrow, if you're willing. I'd like to show you the ranch. Let you see what you'd be getting into. If we decided to move forward. Annie's breath caught. You're not sending me away. Not tonight, he said. Beyond that, let's see what tomorrow brings. It was more than she'd dared hope for. All right. Jesse touched the brim of his hat. I'll come by at first light. Be ready for a long ride. I will. He started to turn away, then paused. Annie. Yes. Thank you for the honesty. It's refreshing. Then he was gone, striding into the darkness, leaving Annie standing in the hotel doorway with her heart racing and her mind whirling. She'd done it. She'd told him the truth, and he hadn't sent her away. Not yet. Tomorrow would bring the ranch, the reality of what life with Jesse Heartland might entail. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new truths. But tonight, Annie McAllister had stopped being invisible. Tonight, for the first time in her life, someone had seen her, really seen her, and hadn't looked away. She climbed the stairs to her room, Jesse's letters still in her pocket, her mother's peppermint candies beside them. Outside her window, the stars were beginning to appear, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Somewhere out there was a ranch, a life, a possibility she'd never dared imagine. Annie undressed slowly, her body aching from travel and tension. As she slipped into bed, she thought of Eleanor, probably planning her wedding to the store clerk, never knowing what she'd given up. Or perhaps Eleanor did know, and that's why she'd refused. Perhaps Eleanor, in her shallow way, had understood that Jesse Heartland needed something more than beauty and charm. He needed someone real, someone strong, someone honest. Perhaps he needed Annie. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, as she drifted towards sleep, Annie felt something she'd never experienced before, the thrilling, terrifying sensation of possibility. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, she would dare to hope. The knock came at first light, just as Jesse had promised. Annie had been awake for an hour already. Dressed in her most practical outfit, a brown wool skirt and white shirtwaist, with her sturdy boots from home. She'd braided her hair tightly and pinned it up, knowing that whatever lay ahead would likely involve wind and weather. Jesse stood in the hallway, wearing work clothes, canvas pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. He looked different from the evening before, more at ease, though the wariness hadn't entirely left his eyes. "Morning," he said, taking in her practical attire with approval. "You ready?" "Yes." Annie grabbed her cloak and followed him downstairs, where he'd already arranged for her trunk to be loaded onto a wagon. "Thought you might want your things with you," he explained. "One way or another." The practicality of it struck her he was prepared for any outcome. If she decided the ranch life wasn't for her, or if he decided she wouldn't suit, her belongings would be ready to go. It was sensible, but it also reinforced the tentative nature of their arrangement. Outside, 2 horses waited alongside the wagon. Jesse's mount was a large bay gelding, while a smaller paint mare stood beside it. "This is Bella," Jesse said, stroking the mare's neck. "She's gentle but sure-footed. Can you ride?" "Yes." Annie didn't mention that her riding had been limited to their old plow horse. She approached Bella carefully, letting the mare smell her hand before mounting. The divided skirt she wore made it possible to ride astride, though she knew it would shock proper society. Jesse swung up onto his horse with easy grace. "It's about 3 hours to the ranch. We'll take it slow." They rode out of Laramie as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold. The town quickly gave way to open country rolling hills covered in sage and spring grass, with the mountains standing sentinel to the west. Annie had never seen such empty vastness, such huge sky. It made her feel small and free at the same time. Jesse rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks. "That's Medicine Bow Peak, and there, see that notch? That's where the old Indian trail runs through to the valley." "It's beautiful," Annie said, meaning it. "Wild, but beautiful." "Wait till you see it in full summer. Wildflowers everywhere. Or winter, when the snow makes everything clean and quiet." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the horse's hooves creating a steady rhythm. Annie found herself studying Jesse when he wasn't looking the way he sat his horse like he'd been born to it, the alert way he scanned the horizon, the competent way he handled the lead rope for the pack horse pulling her wagon. "Tell me about the ranch," she said eventually. Jesse glanced back at her. "It's not large by Wyoming standards. About 2,000 acres, running maybe 300 head of cattle. I've got good water rights, a creek runs through the property year-round. The house," he paused. "The house is sound but simple. Nothing fancy." "I don't need fancy," Annie said. "No," he studied her. "Your sister's letters made it sound like she expected something grander." Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Eleanor has always had grand expectations. I have learned to work with what is—" They stopped to water the horses at a stream. Jesse helped Annie dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through her. "You're doing well," he said, releasing her quickly. "Not everyone takes to Western riding." "I like it," Annie admitted, stretching muscles already beginning to protest. "The freedom of it." Jesse pulled provisions from his saddlebag's bread, cheese, dried beef. They sat on a fallen log to eat, the stream gurgling nearby. Annie noticed how Jesse positioned himself able to see in all directions, his rifle within easy reach. "Are there dangers out here?" she asked. "Sometimes. Wolves in winter, though they mostly leave humans alone. Occasional bears, Indians, though we've had peace for years now. The Arapaho who come through are usually just hunting, not looking for trouble." "You speak as if you know them." "I do. Traded with them some. Learned a bit of their language." He paused. "Does that bother you?" Annie shook her head. "Should it?" "Some folks think any contact with Indians is dangerous or wrong. Some folks haven't had to survive on the frontier." Annie said practically, "I imagine you trade with whoever offers fair deals." Jesse's lips quirked, not quite a smile, but close. "Practical. I like that." They remounted and continued on. The land began to change, becoming more rugged. Pine trees appeared, and the trail wound upward into foothills. Annie found herself grateful for Bella's sure footing as they navigated increasingly rough terrain. "Almost there," Jessie said as they crested a ridge. Annie looked down and caught her breath. A valley spread below them, green and gold in the morning light. A creek wound through it like a silver ribbon, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. Nestled against a grove of cottonwoods sat a house and outbuildings not grand, as Jessie had warned, but solid and welcoming. "Oh," she breathed. "It's not much. It's perfect." Annie interrupted, then blushed at her enthusiasm. "I mean, it looks like a good working ranch." Jessie gave her an unreadable look. "Come on, let's get you settled." They descended into the valley, and Annie got her first close look at what might be her new home. The house was built of logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch running along the front. It needed some repairs. She could see gaps in the chinking and a few loose boards, but the bones were strong. The outbuildings included a barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop currently empty, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Everything showed signs of hard use but good maintenance. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, tall and lean, with graying hair and Indian features. "Annie, this is John Standing Bear," Jessie said. "He helps me run the place. John, this is Miss McAllister." John touched his hat brim politely. "Ma'am, good to see Jessie bringing company home." "Thank you," Annie said, noting the easy familiarity between the two men. Clearly, John was more than just hired help. Jessie dismounted and helped Annie down. "I'll show you the house. John, could you see to the horses?" "Sure thing, boss." Jessie grabbed Annie's small valise from the wagon, leaving her trunk for later. He led her up onto the porch, which creaked under their weight but felt solid enough. "Need some work," he said, almost apologetically. "Most things worth having do," Annie replied. The front door opened into a main room that served as both parlor and dining area. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now but blackened from use. The furniture was sparse but well-made: a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, a bookshelf that made Annie's heart leap. Books. He had books. "Kitchen's through here," Jessie said, leading her into a room that made Annie's practical heart sing. A large cook stove, shelves for dishes and supplies, a dry sink with a pump luxury compared to hauling water. A door led to what looked like a pantry. "Bedrooms upstairs," Jessie said, then cleared his throat. "Bedrooms, 2 of them. I built the second one when I started the correspondence." Annie felt her cheeks warm but kept her voice steady. "Very proper. There's also a root cellar out back and a spring house for keeping things cool. The necessary is behind the house. I've been meaning to build something closer for winter." They returned to the main room. Annie moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines. Shakespeare, the Bible, books on animal husbandry and agriculture, a few novels, some titles she didn't recognize. "You read," she said, unable to hide her pleasure. "When I have time. Long winter evenings. There's not much else to do." He paused. "You're welcome to borrow any of them. If you stay." The reminder of their uncertain situation sobered her. Annie turned to face him. "What happens now?" Jessie removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "Now I show you what life here is really like. No pretense, no prettying it up. Then you decide if it's something you can live with, and I decide." "If I'll do," Annie finished. "That's not—" He stopped, frustrated. "I'm not good with words when they're not written down. What I mean is, we both need to decide if this could work. It's not just about me choosing." "I understand." Annie moved to the window, looking out at the valley. "How long do I have to decide?" "How long do you need?" She turned back to him. "A week long enough to truly see what I'd be getting into?" "A week it is." Jesse replaced his hat. "I'll have John bring your trunk in. You can have the front bedroom, it gets morning sun. I'll bunk with John until we figure things out. I don't want to put you out of your home." "You're not. It's the proper thing." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Can you cook?" "Yes, well." "Good, because neither John nor I can do much beyond beans and biscuit. There's supplies in the pantry. We usually eat supper around sundown." And with that practical arrangement, he was gone, leaving Annie alone in what might be her new home. She explored more thoroughly, finding the house well stocked with basics but lacking any feminine touches. The bedroom Jesse had indicated was sparse, a bed with a straw mattress, a washstand, a trunk for storage. But the window did indeed catch the morning sun, and someone Jesse had put a rag rug on the floor. Annie unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses on pegs and placing her personal items on the washstand. At the bottom of her trunk, wrapped in tissue, was her one luxury, a hand mirror that had been her grandmother's. She placed it carefully on the small shelf, and suddenly the room felt more like hers. Downstairs, she investigated the kitchen and pantry. Jesse hadn't exaggerated. They were well supplied with flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and preserved goods. But she could see the limitations of bachelor cooking in the lack of variety. Her mind immediately began planning meals that would be hearty but more interesting. By the time John brought her trunk, Annie had water heating and bread dough rising. "That's a welcome smell," John said, setting the trunk in the main room. "Been a while since this kitchen saw proper use." "How long have you worked for Jesse?" Annie asked. 5 years, give or take. He found me in a bad way after my tribe was forced onto the reservation. Gave me work when no one else would." John's dark eyes studied her. "He's a good man, fair, honest, maybe too much alone, but good." "Thank you," Annie said, understanding the message underneath Jesse had someone looking out for him. The afternoon flew by as Annie familiarized herself with the kitchen and started preparing supper. She found a ham in the smokehouse and potatoes in the root cellar. With wild onions, John showed her growing by the creek and herbs from a neglected garden patch. She soon had a meal coming together that filled the house with savory aromas. Jesse returned as the sun was setting, dusty and tired from working cattle. He stopped in the doorway, sniffing the air with surprise. "Wash up," Annie told him. "Supper's almost ready." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise pleasure, he nodded and disappeared, returning with hands and face clean, hair damp. John joined them, and the three sat down to a meal of ham, roasted potatoes with herbs, fresh bread, and stewed apples Annie had found preserved in the cellar. The men ate with obvious appreciation, the usual silence of their meals broken by compliments on the food. This is very good," Jessie said, looking at Annie with something like wonder. "I'd forgotten food could taste like this." "It's just simple cooking," Annie said, but she felt warmed by the praise. After supper, John excused himself to the bunkhouse, leaving Annie and Jessie alone. She began clearing the table, and after a moment, Jessie joined her. "You don't have to help," she said. "Fair's fair. You cooked, I can clean." They worked together in companionable silence, Annie washing while Jessie dried. Domestic, she thought, like a real married couple. The thought made her stomach flutter. When the kitchen was clean, they moved to the main room. Jessie added wood to the fire he'd started, and they sat him in a chair, her in the rocker watching the flames. "Tell me about the war," Annie said quietly. Jessie's hand stilled. "Why?" "Because it changed you. Because if I'm going to live here, I should understand." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He told her about enlisting at 19, full of ideals about preserving the Union, about the first battle, when those ideals met reality, about friends who died screaming in field hospitals, about the hunger and cold and fear, about his brother, killed at Antietam while Jesse watched, helpless. "I did things," he said, staring into the fire. "Things that needed doing but that changed me. When it was over, I couldn't go home, couldn't face the farm without Thomas, couldn't pretend to be the boy who'd left. So I came west and built this," Annie said softly. "And built this." He looked at her then. "It's not much, but it's mine. No ghosts here except the ones I brought with me." Annie understood about ghosts, about being the surviving child, the one left to carry burdens. "My brother died when he was 12, she offered. "Fever. After that, I think my parents could never quite forgive me for being the wrong child to survive." Jesse's eyes sharpened with understanding. "Is that why they sent you instead of Eleanor?" "Partly, also because I'm practical enough to actually come. And brave enough to tell the truth when you got here." They fell silent again. But it was a different silence now, one built on shared understanding rather than strangeness. "I should retire," Annie said eventually. "Dawn comes early, I imagine." "It does." Jessie stood when she did, a courtesy she hadn't expected. "Annie." "Yes." "Thank you, for supper, for listening." "Thank you for telling me," she replied. The next few days fell into a pattern. Annie rose early to make breakfast, sending Jessie and John out well-fed. She spent her days setting the house to rights, cleaning, organizing, mending things long neglected. The vegetable garden, she discovered, could be salvaged with work. She found satisfaction in bringing order to the bachelor household. Jesse showed her around the ranch when his work allowed. He taught her to milk the 2 dairy cows, showed her where to gather eggs once they got chickens again, explained the patterns of ranch life. In the evenings, they talked by the fire, sharing stories, learning each other's rhythms. On the 4th day, a neighbor came calling a woman named Elizabeth Custer, married to a former cavalry officer turned rancher. "Heard Jesse had a lady visitor," Elizabeth said with frank curiosity. "Thought I'd come see if you needed anything." Annie served coffee and the cake she'd made that morning, grateful for female company. Elizabeth was forthright and friendly, offering advice about frontier housekeeping and extending an invitation to their ranch. "It's good to see Jesse with someone," Elizabeth said as she prepared to leave. "He's been alone too long. We all worried he'd turn into a hermit." "We're not, that is, nothing's decided," Annie felt compelled to clarify. Elizabeth smiled. "Honey, I've seen how that man looks at you when he thinks you're not watching. Something's already decided, even if neither of you knows it yet." That evening, Jesse suggested a ride to watch the sunset from the ridge. They sat their horses side by side, looking out over the valley painted gold and purple by the dying light. "It's like your letters described," Annie said softly. "Better with company," Jesse replied, then seemed to catch himself. "That is, yes," Annie agreed. "Better with company." They rode back in the gathering dusk, and Annie felt something settling in her chest. This place, this life, it was hard, isolated, demanding, but it was also real in a way her life in Missouri had never been. Here, she mattered. Her work had immediate purpose. And Jesse was nothing like she'd expected, and everything she hadn't known she needed. Quiet but thoughtful. Scarred but not broken. Lonely but not desperate. He treated her with respect, valuing her opinions, noticing her contributions. On the 6th night, as they sat by the fire, Jesse reading while Annie mended one of his shirts, he suddenly set his book aside. "Annie." She looked up from her sewing. "Yes. This week, it's been good. Better than good. The house feels alive again. I'd forgotten what that was like." Her heart began to race. "I've enjoyed it too. I know I'm not what you probably imagined for a husband. I'm not social or smooth-talking. I've got ghosts that sometimes wake me at night. This life is hard, sometimes harsh. But I'd try to be good to you. I'd never raise a hand to you, never belittle you. You'd be my partner, not my servant." Annie set aside the shirt, her hands trembling slightly. "Jesse." "You don't have to answer now. You still have tomorrow to decide, but I wanted you to know where I stand." He paused, vulnerability flickering in his eyes. "I'd be proud to have you as my wife, Annie McAllister, not as a replacement for anyone, but as yourself." Annie felt tears prick her eyes. When had anyone ever chosen her for herself? "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Your letters to Eleanor, all those beautiful words about sunsets and dreams. Did you mean them?" Jesse's smile was rueful. "I meant them, but I was trying to be someone I thought a lady would want, trying to sound educated and romantic instead of just a broken-down soldier playing at being a rancher." "You're not broken," Annie said firmly. "Scarred, maybe, but not broken. And I like the letters, but I like the real man better." Something flared in Jesse's eyes, hope, perhaps, or the beginning of joy, but he only nodded. "Think on it," he said. "Tomorrow, let me know." Annie lay awake long into the night, but not from indecision. Her mind was made up, had been, perhaps, from the moment she'd seen Jesse's face light up at her cooking, or when he'd shared his war stories, or when they'd watched the sunset together. Tomorrow, she would say yes, not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she wanted to build a life with this quiet, complicated man in this beautiful, demanding land. She was done being invisible. Here with Jesse, she could be seen, valued, needed. Here, she could be herself. And that, Annie thought as sleep finally claimed her, was worth more than all the romantic letters in the world. The 7th morning dawned with an ominous sky. Annie woke to the sound of wind rattling the windows and Jesse's voice carrying urgently from outside. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find him and John standing there securing everything they could. "Storm coming," Jesse said when he saw her. "Big one, by the look of it. We need to get the cattle closer to shelter." Annie had never seen him truly worried before. "What can I do?" "Help John secure things here. I'm riding out to bring in the herd from the north pasture." He was already saddling his horse, movements quick and efficient. "That's dangerous in a storm," John said, frowning. "More dangerous to leave them out there? They'll scatter or freeze if this turns bad, as I think." Jesse swung up into the saddle. "If I'm not back by dark, don't come looking. I'll shelter if I have to." He was gone before Annie could protest, disappearing into the growing wind. She turned to John, fear cold in her stomach. "Will he be all right?" "Jesse knows this land better than anyone," John said, but she caught the worry in his eyes. "Come, we have work to do." They spent the morning battening down everything loose, bringing extra wood to the house, securing the barn. The temperature dropped steadily, and by noon, the first fat raindrops began to fall. "Inside now," John ordered as the drops became a deluge. Annie protested. "But Jesse would want you safe. Come." She allowed him to guide her to the house, but stood at the window, searching the gray curtain of rain for any sign of horse and rider. The storm intensified, rain turning to hail that hammered the roof like gunfire. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that shook the house. "I'm going to check the barn," John shouted over the noise. "Stay here." Annie paced, unable to settle. This morning, she'd planned to tell Jesse yes to start their life together. Now he was out in this maelstrom, and she might never get the chance. The afternoon crawled by. The storm, if anything, grew worse. Water began seeping under the door despite the sandbags John had placed. The wind found every crack in the chinking, whistling through like vengeful spirits. Then, through the chaos, Annie heard something else, cattle lowing, frightened and close. She ran to the window and could just make out shapes moving through the rain. The herd. But where was Jesse? She grabbed her cloak and plunged outside before reason could stop her. The wind nearly knocked her down, rain hitting her face like needles. She fought her way toward the sounds, slipping in mud that hadn't been there that morning. "Jessie!" she screamed, but the wind tore the word away. Lightning illuminated the scene for an instant, cattle milling in confusion. And there, trying to guide them toward the barn, a lone rider, Jesse. But something was wrong. He was slumped in the saddle, barely staying mounted. Annie ran, slipping and sliding, reaching him just as he started to fall. She caught him, staggering under his weight, rain streaming into her eyes. "Annie," his voice was weak. "Get inside. Not safe." "Not without you." She saw the problem, then his left arm hung useless, and blood mixed with rain on his sleeve. "You're hurt." "Spooked steer. Knocked me into a ravine. Think the arm's broken. Need to get the cattle?" "John's handling the cattle. We need to get you inside." Somehow, between them, they managed it. Jesse leaning heavily on Annie, stumbling through mud that sucked at their boots. By the time they reached the house, both were soaked through and Jesse was shivering uncontrollably. "Fire!" Annie ordered herself, half dragging Jesse to the hearth. "Get warm. Get dry." She stoked the fire to blazing, then turned to Jesse. He was trying to remove his coat one-handed, face gray with pain. Annie batted his good hand away. "Let me." She worked carefully, easing the sodden coat off, trying not to jostle the injured arm. His shirt was torn and bloody. When she pulled it away, she gasped. Not just the arm, his entire left side was scraped raw, and a deep gash ran from shoulder to elbow. "It's not as bad as it looks," Jessie said through chattering teeth. "Liar." Annie's hands shook as she examined the wounds. The arm was definitely broken. She could see the unnatural angle. The gash would need stitching. "We need the doctor." "Can't get to town in this. You'll have to do it." I've never." "You've sewn plenty. Same principle." His attempt at a smile turned into a grimace. "There's whiskey in the pantry, needles in the drawer." Annie wanted to argue, but another look at the steadily bleeding gash decided her. She gathered what she needed: whiskey, clean cloth, her sewing kit, thanking God her mother had insisted she learn fine stitching. "Drink," she ordered, handing Jesse the whiskey bottle. He took several long pulls while she cleaned the wounds, hissing when the alcohol hit torn flesh. Annie forced her hands steady, pushing aside the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Jesse needed her strong. "Ready?" she asked when the gash was clean. "Do it." The stitching was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Each puncture made Jesse tense, though he stayed silent. Annie worked as quickly as she dared, making small, neat stitches like her mother had taught her, trying not to think about how this was flesh, not fabric, Jesse's flesh, the man she'd decided to marry. "Almost done," she murmured, not sure if she was reassuring him or herself. When she tied off the last stitch, Jesse's face was white, sweat mixing with leftover rain, but the bleeding had stopped. "The arm now," she said. "Needs setting first. You'll have to—" He stopped, seeing her expression. "Or we wait for John." As if summoned, John burst through the door, as soaked as they had been. He took in the scene, the blood, the stitched wound, Jesse's obvious pain, and moved immediately to help. "Broken?" he asked. "Yes." John's hands were gentle but sure as he examined the arm. "Clean break. I can set it. Annie, hold him steady." Annie positioned herself behind Jesse, arms around his chest. She felt him tense as John manipulated the bone. "On 3, John said. 1, 2. He pulled on 2. There was a horrible grinding sensation that Annie felt through Jesse's body, and his sharp intake of breath, but the arm was straight again. "Good man," John said. "Annie, there's laudanum in my saddlebag. For the pain." But when Annie returned with it, Jesse waved it away. "Makes me foggy. Just help me to bed." Together, they got him upstairs, Annie trying not to think about how this was the first time she'd been in his room. John helped Jesse into dry clothes while Annie waited outside. Then they settled him in bed, his arm splinted and bound. "I'll stay with him," Annie said. John nodded. "I'll see to the stock. We didn't lose any, got them all in the near pasture. You did good, getting him inside." When John left, Annie pulled the rocking chair from her room to Jesse's bedside. He looked vulnerable lying there, all his strength drained away. "You should rest too," he said, words slurring with exhaustion. "I'm not leaving you." "Stubborn woman. You're one to talk, riding out alone into a storm." "Had to. Cattle are everything here. Lose them. Lose the ranch." Annie understood then, in a way she hadn't before, just how precarious life was out here. One bad storm, one wrong decision, and everything could be lost. "Sleep," she told him. "I'll be here." Jesse's good hand found hers. "Annie, what you were going to tell me today before the storm?" She squeezed his fingers gently. "It can wait." "No, please, in case." "Don't say that." "Please." Annie looked at his face, drawn with pain but earnest. "Yes," she said simply. "My answer is yes." Something eased in his expression. "Good. That's good." He slept then, but restlessly, fevered from shock and pain. Annie bathed his face with cool water, kept the fire burning, and prayed harder than she ever had before. The storm raged on outside, but her world had narrowed to this room, this man, this vigil. Sometime near midnight, Jesse's fever spiked. He tossed restlessly, muttering words she couldn't understand, battle commands. She realized, mixed with names of men probably long dead, his war ghosts coming to visit in his weakness. "Shh," Annie soothed, holding his good hand. "You're safe. You're home." His eyes opened, glassy with fever. "Annie?" "I'm here." "Don't leave. Everyone leaves." "I won't leave," she promised. "I'm right here." He settled some at that, though the fever didn't break until nearly dawn. Annie dozed fitfully in the chair, jerking awake every time he moved, checking the bandages for fresh bleeding. When gray light finally filtered through the window, the storm had passed. Jesse's breathing was easier, his skin cooler to the touch. The crisis had passed. Annie stood, stretching muscles cramped from her awkward position, and moved to the window. The world outside was transformed, debris scattered everywhere, the creek running high and muddy, fence posts down. But the house stood, the barn stood, and Jesse lived. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" She turned to find Jesse awake, watching her with clearer eyes. "How do you feel?" "Like I got in a fight with a mountain and lost." He tried to shift and winced. "But alive. Thanks to you. Thanks to John, too, and your own stubbornness." "Annie," his voice turned serious. "Last night did I dream it, or did you say yes?" "You didn't dream it. Even after seeing what life here can be, the danger, the isolation." Annie moved back to the bedside, taking his good hand again. "Jesse, last night when you were out in that storm, all I could think was that I might never get to tell you yes, never get to build a life with you. The danger scared me. Yes, but the thought of not being here, not being with you, that scared me more." Jesse's thumb stroked over her knuckles. "I'm not an easy man, Annie. The war left marks you can't see. Some nights you have nightmares. I know. I heard them last night." She leaned closer. "I have my own ghosts. Jesse, everyone does, but maybe together, we can make them quieter." He studied her face for a long moment. "You sure you're the plain sister? Because right now, you look beautiful to me." Annie felt herself blush. "That's the fever talking." "No, it's the truth." He tugged gently on her hand. "Come here." She leaned down, and he kissed her, tentative at first. Then, with growing certainty, it was Annie's first real kiss, and nothing like the romantic novels suggested. It was better real and warm and promising. When they parted, both were breathless. "We'll need to go to town when I can travel," Jesse said. "See the preacher? Make it official." "There's no rush. You need to heal first." "Woman, I've waited long enough for a partner. Now that I've found her, I'm not waiting any longer than necessary." John's voice carried from downstairs. "Something about breakfast." Annie pressed one more kiss to Jesse's forehead. "Rest. I'll bring you something to eat." "Annie," he called as she reached the door. "Thank you for the stitching, the nursing, for saying yes, for everything." "You're welcome," she said simply, and went to start what would be the first of thousands of mornings in this house. The next days passed in a blur of nursing and storm cleanup. Jesse chafed at being bedridden, but submitted to Annie's care with mostly good grace. His arm healed cleanly, the gash too, leaving what would be another scar to add to his collection. Elizabeth Custer visited as soon as the roads were passable, bringing supplies and gossip. "Heard you played nurse during the storm," she said to Annie. "Also heard something about a wedding being planned. News traveled fast on the frontier. When Jesse's healed," Annie confirmed. "About time. George will be pleased. He's been trying to get Jesse to socialize more for years." Elizabeth's eyes twinkled. "Though I suspect you'll do a better job of that than we ever did." 3 weeks after the storm, Jesse was well enough to travel to town. They made a strange party, Jesse still favoring his left arm. Annie in her best dress, water-stained but clean, and John standing bare as witness. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church with only a handful of witnesses, the Custers, the preacher's wife, a few townspeople. Annie had no flowers, no veil, no family to give her away. But when Jesse took her hand and spoke his vows in his steady voice, she felt richer than any society bride. "I, Jesse, take you, Annie, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Annie repeated the words, meaning every one. She had already seen sickness, had already faced worse. Whatever came next, they would face together. When the preacher pronounced them married and Jesse kissed her, she heard Elizabeth sniffle happily. Even John standing bare looked suspiciously misty-eyed. They had dinner at the hotel, a real celebration meal that Annie didn't have to cook. Gifts appeared: preserves from Elizabeth, a new bridle from the Custers, a beautifully beaded blanket from John that he admitted shyly was from his sister. To new beginnings. George Custer toasted, raising his glass. "To partnership," Jesse corrected, his eyes on Annie. That night, in their hotel room, Jesse was gentle and patient with his new bride. Annie discovered that here too. Reality was different from novels, more awkward but also more tender, more human, when they lay together afterward. Jesse's arm carefully around her. She felt a completeness she'd never known before. "No regrets?" Jesse asked quietly. "None. You—" "Only that I wrote to the wrong sister first." Annie laughed softly. "Maybe you wrote to the right one. If you'd written to me, I might never have had the courage to respond. Fate, then." "Or Providence." She traced the scar on his chest. Another war souvenir. "Either way, I'm here now." "Yes," Jesse agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You're here." They returned to the ranch the next day. Annie now officially Mrs. Jesse Heartland. The house looked the same, but everything felt different. This was truly home now, truly hers. That evening, as she cooked supper in her kitchen while Jesse and John discussed ranch business at her table, Annie thought about the letter she would write to Eleanor. How could she explain that in losing everything she thought she wanted, she had found everything she needed? The storm had tested them early, shown them they could weather crisis together. There would be other storms, other challenges. Life on the frontier guaranteed it, but Annie no longer feared them. She had found her place, her purpose, her partner, and in the finding, she had discovered that she had never been the plain sister, the spare daughter. She had always been Annie Strong, capable, worthy of love. Jesse caught her eye across the room and smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Annie smiled back, then returned to her cooking, humming softly. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the mountains purple and gold just as Jesse had described in his letters. But he'd been right. It was better shared. Everything was better shared. 3 months had passed since the wedding, and Annie had settled into the rhythm of ranch life with a contentment she'd never known possible. The summer had been kind, bringing enough rain for good grazing and a vegetable garden that flourished under her care. She stood in that garden now, picking beans for supper, when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Jesse appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, a precaution that had become second nature. But as the wagon drew closer, Annie saw him relax. It was George and Elizabeth Custer, making one of their periodic social calls. "Annie, Jesse," Elizabeth called out before the wagon had even stopped. "We bring news from town." But as Elizabeth climbed down, Annie noticed her friend's expression was troubled beneath the cheerful greeting. George, too, looked unusually serious. "Come inside," Annie said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll make coffee." They gathered in the main room, and Annie served coffee and the apple cake she'd made that morning, but the usual pleasant chatter was absent. Elizabeth kept glancing at George, who seemed to be gathering his courage. "Out with it," Jesse said finally. "What's wrong?" George cleared his throat. "There was a letter at the post office, Jesse for Annie, from Missouri." Annie's heart skipped. Letters from home were rare. Her parents had written only once. A terse acknowledgement of her marriage. Eleanor hadn't written at all. George pulled an envelope from his coat, handling it as if it might bite. "The postmaster said a real pretty lady was asking about you both. Said she'd come all the way from Missouri. Said her name was Eleanor McAllister." The cup slipped from Annie's suddenly numb fingers. Coffee splashing across the floor. Jesse was on his feet instantly, but his eyes were on the letter, not the spill. "Eleanor's here," Annie whispered. "In Laramie." "At the Laramie house," George confirmed. "Been there 2 days, according to what we heard." Jesse took the letter, his jaw tight. "Why didn't she write first?" "Maybe that's what this is about," Elizabeth suggested gently. With trembling hands, Annie took the letter and broke the seal. Eleanor's flowery handwriting filled the page. Asterisk, dearest Annie. Asterisk, I hope this letter finds you well. I have made a terrible mistake in fact, William Morrison proved to be not the man I thought had, and our parents have made life unbearable since your departure. I realize now what I gave up, and I have come to make things right. Asterisk, I know you have been posing as me, and I do not blame you for the deception. But surely Mr. Heartland deserves to meet his actual intended. I am prepared to honor the original arrangement if he still wishes it. We can resolve this situation quietly, with dignity for all involved. Asterisk, I await your response at the hotel. Asterisk, your loving sister, Eleanor Asterisk. The silence that followed was deafening. Annie felt as if the floor had opened beneath her feet. All her happiness, her security, her new life, Eleanor could destroy it all with her pretty face, an assumption that Annie had been posing as her. "She thinks I lied," Annie said numbly. "She thinks I've been pretending to be her this whole time." Jesse took the letter, scanning it quickly. His expression darkened with each line. "She has no idea what really happened? None at all." "What will you do?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Annie looked at Jesse, fear clawing at her throat. They'd been so happy. The ranch was thriving, their partnership growing stronger each day. Just last week, she'd begun to suspect she might be carrying their child, though she hadn't told Jesse yet, wanting to be certain. "We'll go to town," Jesse said firmly. "Tomorrow, Face this head on. Jessie, Annie began, but he crossed to her, taking her hands. You're my wife, he said, loud enough for the Custers to hear. Nothing your sister says or does changes that. We'll go to town, set her straight, and send her on her way. But Annie saw the worry in his eyes. Eleanor was beautiful, charming, everything Annie wasn't. What if seeing her made Jessie realize what he'd missed out on? What if? Stop, Jessie said quietly, reading her thoughts. I chose you. Remember, not some fantasy in letters, but you. The Custers left soon after, promising discretion but knowing the news would spread anyway. Annie tried to go about her normal evening routine, but her hands shook as she prepared supper. Jessie and John ate in unusual silence, the weight of tomorrow hanging over them all. That night, lying in Jessie's arms, Annie finally voiced her fears. What if she's right? What if you do deserve to meet your actual intended? Jessie's arm tightened around her. I did meet her. I married her. Your sister was never my intended. Annie, she was a stranger I wrote letters to. You're the woman who stitched me up in a storm, who made this house a home, who works beside me every day. That's what's real. But she's beautiful. So are you. Jessie, be serious. He rolled to face her, his expression intense in the moonlight. I am being serious. You think beauty is just a pretty face. Beauty is strength. Annie, beauty is honesty. Beauty is the way you hum when you're happy, the way you attack every challenge head on, the way you look at me like I'm worth something despite all my scars. Annie felt tears slip down her cheeks. I'm scared. What if... No what ifs, Jessie said firmly. We'll face her together. That's what marriage means. They made the trip to town the next morning, both dressed in their best clothes armor for the battle ahead. Annie's stomach churned with more than just nerves. And she had to ask Jessie to stop the wagon once so she could be sick behind some bushes. You all right? He asked, concern creasing his brow. Just nervous, she said, not ready to share her suspicion, not with this hanging over them. Laramie seemed busier than usual, and Annie realized with a sinking heart that news of Eleanor's arrival had spread. People watched them with undisguised curiosity as they made their way to the hotel. Eleanor was holding court in the hotel parlor. Annie saw through the window. Several men had gathered around her, drawn like moths to her golden flame. She wore a traveling dress of deep green that emphasized her perfect figure, her hair arranged in elaborate curls. She looked exactly like what she was, a beautiful woman who had never known a day's hard work. Ready? Jessie asked. Annie lifted her chin. Ready. They entered together, and the conversation died instantly. Eleanor's cornflower blue eyes widened as she took in Annie's appearance, the calluses on her hands, the simple dress, the way she stood beside Jessie as an equal rather than behind him as a subordinate. Annie, Eleanor rose gracefully, gliding forward with outstretched hands. Oh, my dear sister. How? Well, you look. The pause before, well, spoke volumes. Annie didn't take the offered hands. Eleanor, I received your letter. Then you know why I've come. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Jessie, and her smile became dazzling. Mr. Hartland, at last we meet properly. Jessie's expression could have been carved from granite. Mrs. McAllister, or is it Mrs. Morrison? Eleanor had the grace to blush slightly. Still McAllister, that didn't work out as planned. I see. Like our correspondence. That was a misunderstanding, Eleanor said quickly, her laugh tinkling like bells. I was young, confused, but I'm here now, ready to honor our arrangement. What arrangement? Jessie's voice was dangerously quiet. Eleanor faltered slightly. Why? Our engagement, the letters, the proposal. Which you refused. Annie interjected, quite definitively, as I recall. I was foolish, Eleanor said, tears gathering prettily in her eyes. But surely, Mr. Hartland deserves the choice after all. He proposed to me, not— She gestured vaguely at Annie. Careful, Jessie warned. And something in his tone made Eleanor step back. Whatever you were about to say about my wife, I'd reconsider. Your wife, Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. But the marriage can be annulled. She deceived you, posed as me. Stop! Annie found her voice at last. I never posed as you, Eleanor. I told Jessie the truth the moment I arrived, that I was Annie, not you. That our parents sent me as a replacement because they'd spent his money and couldn't bear the scandal. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. But that's not— Mother said— Mother lied, Annie said flatly. Just as you're lying now, pretending you want this marriage. What do you really want? Eleanor, money. A way to escape whatever mess you've made back home. For the first time in their lives, Eleanor looked at Annie with something approaching respect. You've changed. Yes, I have. Annie felt Jessie's hand find hers, steady and warm. I'm not invisible anymore. Not the spare daughter to be used and discarded. I'm Annie Hartland, and I'm exactly where I belong. Eleanor's pretty facade crumbled. It's not fair I was supposed to have choices, options. William turned out to be nothing but promises, and Father says I've disgraced the family. Mother suggested I come here, that surely Mr. Hartland would prefer the original to the copy. Your mother suggested. Jessie's voice was ice. So this is another family scheme. Everything's a scheme with them, Eleanor said bitterly. But I thought maybe. She looked around the parlor at the watching faces, then back at Annie and Jessie, standing united. I thought wrong, apparently. For a moment, Annie saw her sister clearly not the golden child, but a young woman who had been as trapped by family expectations as Annie had been, just in a different way. Eleanor had been raised to trade on her beauty, never developing anything deeper. Now that currency had failed her, and she was lost. Eleanor, Annie said more gently, you can't have my life, but perhaps you can build your own. With what? Eleanor's laugh was bitter. I have nothing. No skills, no money, no prospects. At least you knew how to work, how to survive. All I know is how to look pretty and say charming things. Those are skills too, a new voice said. Everyone turned to see Elizabeth Custer in the doorway. Perhaps not ranch skills, but skills nonetheless. Elizabeth entered the parlor like a general taking command. There's a finishing school in Denver looking for a deportment teacher. Someone who can teach young ladies how to navigate society. The pay isn't much, but it's respectable work. Eleanor blinked. You'd help me after I tried to steal your sister's husband. Elizabeth's smile was sharp. Yes, well, we all make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them. Jessie stepped forward. I'll pay for your passage to Denver. Consider it a wedding gift to Annie, the gift of never having to see you again. Jessie, Annie protested, but he squeezed her hand. It's a small price for our peace, he murmured. Eleanor looked between them, all Annie with her work-worn hands and simple dress, Jessie with his scars and steady presence, Elizabeth with her no-nonsense practicality. Then she looked down at herself, perfect and useless. I accept, she said quietly. And Annie, I'm sorry. For everything. For letting them send you in my place. For coming here. For not seeing you all those years. Annie felt something ease in her chest, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of it. Take the opportunity. Eleanor, learn to be more than just beautiful. The rest was quickly arranged. Eleanor would take the next stage to Denver, with a letter of introduction from Elizabeth. Jessie paid for her ticket and lodging, his face expressing clearly that he was purchasing their freedom from future interference. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor caught Annie's arm. "Is he good to you truly? Better than I dreamed possible." Eleanor's smile was sad but genuine. "Then you got the better bargain after all." The ride home was quiet, both Jessie and Annie processing what had happened. Finally, as the ranch came into view, Jessie spoke. "You were magnificent, standing up to her like that." "I was terrified," Annie admitted. "Couldn't tell. You looked like a warrior defending her territory." "Our territory," Annie corrected, then took a deep breath. "Jessie, there's something I need to tell you." He glanced at her, concern flickering across his features. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think so. I'm fairly certain." She struggled for words, then blurted, "I think I'm carrying our child." Jessie pulled the wagon to such an abrupt stop that the horses snorted in protest. He turned to stare at her, his expression cycling through surprise, wonder, and joy so quickly it made her dizzy. "A child, you're sure?" "Fairly sure, the sickness this morning and other signs." "Annie." Her name was a prayer on his lips. Then he was kissing her, right there on the wagon seat in full view of anyone who might be watching. A child. Our child. "You're happy." "Happy?" He laughed, the sound rich and full. "Woman, you've given me everything. A home, a partner, and now a family happy doesn't begin to cover it." When they reached the ranch, John Standing Bear took one look at their faces and grinned. "Good news." "The best," Jessie confirmed. Annie faced down her sister and sent her packing. "And we're having a baby." John's weathered face split into a rare, full smile. "About time this place had some young ones running around. I'll teach 'em to track and ride." "Or her," Annie said. "Or her," John agreed easily. "Either way, they'll be tough. Look at their parents." That evening, as Annie prepared supper in her kitchen, in her home, carrying her child, she felt a peace she'd never known. Eleanor's visit, rather than destroying her happiness, had only confirmed it. She wasn't living someone else's life or filling someone else's place. This was her life, chosen and built day by day. Jessie came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, hands spreading protectively over her still flat stomach. "No regrets." "Never," Annie said firmly. "Though I do wonder what Eleanor will make of herself in Denver." "That's her journey now," Jessie said. "You have your own to focus on." "Ours," Annie corrected, leaning back into his warmth. "Our journey." Outside, the sun was setting in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. But for once, neither of them watched it. They were too busy looking forward, imagining a small child with Jessie's dark hair or Annie's determined chin, running through the garden, learning to ride, growing up strong and loved in this wild, beautiful place. Eleanor's shadow had passed over their happiness and moved on, leaving them stronger for having weathered it. Annie was no longer the replacement bride, the second choice, the spare daughter. She was herself, complete and valued, building a life worth living with a man worth loving. And that, she thought as Jessie spun her around for an impromptu dance in their kitchen, was the greatest triumph of all. 6 months had passed since Eleanor's visit, and Annie's belly now rounded with the promise of new life. The autumn air was crisp as she stood on the porch, watching Jessie and John work with a new horse in the corral. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach, feeling the baby's movements still a wonder after all these weeks. The morning had started like any other, with Annie making breakfast and the men discussing the day's work. But just as she was clearing the dishes, the sound of an approaching carriage made them all freeze. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and unexpected ones usually meant trouble. Jessie emerged from the barn, rifle in hand as always, but Annie saw his shoulders relax slightly when he recognized the carriage. It was Dr. Benjamin Rush from town, accompanied by someone Annie couldn't quite make out. So, Mrs. Heartland, the doctor called as he climbed down. Mr. Heartland, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I bring a visitor who was most insistent. The carriage door opened, and Annie's breath caught. Eleanor stepped out. But this was not the Eleanor who had left 6 months ago. Gone were the elaborate curls and fancy dress. She wore a simple traveling suit of navy wool, her hair pulled back in a modest bun. Most shocking of all, her hands, those previously lily-white hands, showed signs of actual work. "Annie," Eleanor said, her voice uncertain. "Jessie, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I had to come. I have news that affects you both." Jessie moved protectively closer to Annie. "State your business quickly. Eleanor, my wife shouldn't be standing in the cold." Eleanor's eyes went to Annie's obvious condition, and something softened in her face. "A baby. Oh, Annie, I'm glad." She seemed to gather herself. "May we speak inside? What I have to say shouldn't be discussed in the open." Annie exchanged glances with Jessie, who nodded reluctantly. They made their way inside, Dr. Rush following. Eleanor sat straight-backed in the chair offered, her entire demeanor different from her last visit. "First," Eleanor began, "I owe you better apologies than I gave before. I've had 6 months to think about my behavior, my choices, our family. The school in Denver, they've been patient with me, teaching me more than just how to teach others. I've learned about work, real work, about earning respect rather than demanding it." "That's good," Annie said carefully. "But why are you here?" Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a letter. "This came to the school 2 weeks ago. From Mother. Father is dead." The words hung in the air like smoke. Annie sank into her chair, Jessie's hand immediately finding her shoulder. "How?" Annie whispered. "His heart, Doctor. Rush can explain better. Mother wrote to him as well, asking him to break the news to you gently, given your condition." "Doctor," Rush cleared his throat. "A sudden attack, from what I understand. He went quickly." Annie waited for grief, but found only a hollow sadness. Her father had been a hard man, one who had seen her only as a burden or a tool. Still, he had been her father. "Mother wants you to come home," Eleanor continued. "Both of us. She says the farm is failing without Father, that it's our duty as daughters to return and help." "No." Jessie's voice was flat. "Annie's not traveling anywhere in her condition, and certainly not back to people who threw her away." "I agree," Eleanor said, surprising them. "Which is why I'm here. Mother doesn't know I've come. She thinks I'm convincing you to return. Instead, I'm here to warn you." "Warn us," Annie found her voice. "Mother has been talking to lawyers. She says, since you married under unusual circumstances, she might have grounds to challenge the marriage, claim you were coerced, that Jessie took advantage of a desperate situation. She wants to bring you home and find you a proper husband, one who will invest in saving the farm." Annie's hand went to her stomach. "She wants to sell me again." "Essentially, yes, and she's desperate enough to try anything." Eleanor leaned forward. "But I've learned some things in Denver, made some connections. There's a lawyer there, Mr. Clarence Darrow, who says Mother has no case. Your marriage is legal. You were of age, and you have witnesses that you told Jessie the truth from the start. He's willing to write a formal letter stating such, if you need it." "Why?" Jessie's eyes narrowed. "Why help us?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Because I've learned what family really means. It's not blood or duty or manipulation. It's choice. And Annie chose you, chose this life. Mother and Father never understood that Annie was the strong one, the valuable one. I'm just starting to learn it myself." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "I'll return to Denver on tomorrow's stage. I've left Mr. Darrow's information with Dr. Rush. If Mother tries anything, you'll be prepared. Eleanor, Annie said softly, what about the farm? What will happen? I've convinced Mother to sell it. The proceeds will be enough for her to live modestly in town with her sister. As for me... Eleanor's smile was rueful but genuine. I'm staying in Denver. The school has offered me a permanent position. I'm good at it, surprisingly, teaching young women to be more than ornaments, to have substance beneath the surface. Ironic, isn't it? Growth often is. Annie said. Eleanor moved toward the door, then turned back. The baby, do you know? Not yet, Annie said, but healthy and active. Dr. Rush says. I'm glad. Eleanor's voice was soft. You'll be a wonderful mother. Annie, you always took care of everyone else. Now you have people who take care of you in return. After Eleanor and Dr. Rush left, Annie sat staring at the fire, processing everything. Jesse knelt beside her chair, his hand covering hers. You all right? My father is dead, Annie said slowly. My mother wants to drag me back. My sister has become someone I don't recognize. And I feel relieved. Is that wrong? No, Jesse said firmly. Family isn't always blood. John Standing Bear taught me that. Sometimes family is who stands beside you when the storms come. As if summoned by his name, John appeared in the doorway. Everything well? Annie's father passed, Jesse explained. Her mother is making threats about the marriage. John's expression darkened. She threatens my family. The simple declaration *my family* made tears spring to Annie's eyes. John had never said it so plainly before, but his actions had shown it daily. He was teaching her Arapaho words for when the baby came, had carved a beautiful cradle in the evenings, treated her with the same protective care he showed Jesse. We have a lawyer if needed, Annie assured him. Eleanor, she's changed. She came to warn us, to help. People can change. John agreed. Sometimes they need to lose everything to find out who they really are. That night, as they lay in bed, Annie felt the baby kick strongly. She guided Jesse's hand to the spot, smiling at his wonder that never seemed to fade no matter how many times he felt it. I've been thinking about names, she said. If it's a boy, I'd like to call him Thomas. For your brother, not my father. Jesse's hand stilled. Annie. He should be remembered by someone who loved him. Annie continued. And if it's a girl? Margaret, Jesse suggested. After the grandmother you actually liked. Margaret, Annie agreed. Maggie for short. They lay in comfortable silence, Jesse's hand making gentle circles on her belly. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, but it didn't frighten Annie anymore. She knew the difference now between real threats and the wildness that was simply part of this land. Jesse, she said eventually. What Eleanor said about family being choice rather than blood, she was right, wasn't she? She was, though it took her long enough to figure it out. I chose you, Annie said softly. Every day, I choose you, this life, this place. And I choose you, Jesse replied. Not because a letter told me to, not because of obligation, but because you're my partner, my equal, the woman who stitched me up and stood by me and made this empty house a home. The baby kicked again, as if joining the conversation. Annie laughed softly. I think someone else is choosing us too. Smart kid, Jesse murmured. Takes after his mother. Her mother, Annie corrected, though they both knew they'd be happy either way. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from Denver. True to her word, Eleanor had arranged everything. Mr. Darrow's letter was thorough and legally sound, making it clear that any challenge to the Heartland marriage would be met with fierce opposition. There was also a personal note from Eleanor. *Annie. Mother has agreed to sell the farm. I told her you were beyond her reach. that you had found a life worth living. I think, perhaps, she always knew you were stronger than me. Maybe that's why she tried so hard to control you. I'm enclosing a photograph from the school. That's me in the back, with my students. I'm teaching them literature and deportment, but also strength and self-reliance. You taught me that. Even if you didn't know it, I won't contact you again unless you wish it. You deserve your peace, but know that I'm grateful for the lesson you gave me that we can choose who we become. Your sister, Eleanor Asterisk. Annie studied the photograph. Eleanor stood behind a group of young women, her face serene and confident in a way that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with purpose. She had found her place, just as Annie had found hers. "No more ghosts from the past?" Jessie asked, reading over her shoulder. "No more ghosts," Annie confirmed. "Only the future now." "Doctor." Rush visited weekly as Annie's time grew closer, pronouncing her healthy and strong. Elizabeth Custer organized the ranch wives to prepare baby clothes and blankets, turning Annie's impending motherhood into a community celebration. Even the taciturn cowboys who occasionally worked for Jessie left small gifts on the porch: a carved rattle, a pair of tiny moccasins, a soft rabbit fur. On a cold December morning, exactly 1 year after Annie had first left Missouri, she woke to the familiar tightening that told her the baby was coming. Jessie, veteran of many cattle births but terrified at this human one, rode hard for Doctor Rush while John Standing Bear stayed with Annie, calm and steady as always. "Breathe," John instructed. "The baby knows what to do. Trust your body." By the time Jessie returned with the doctor and Elizabeth Custer, Annie was deep in the work of bringing new life into the world. Jessie held her hand, whispering encouragement, while Elizabeth and the doctor guided her through each stage. As the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Margaret Sarah Hartland entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to every eye in the room. She had Jessie's dark hair but Annie's stubborn chin, and when she opened her eyes, they were the gray of winter storms. "She's perfect," Jessie breathed, touching his daughter's tiny hand with one finger. "Strong," John pronounced from the doorway. "Like her mother." Annie, exhausted but exhilarated, looked around the room at the faces of her chosen family. Her husband, her friend, the man who had become a father to them both, and now her daughter. This was what Eleanor had finally understood. Family wasn't about blood or duty or manipulation. It was about choice, commitment, and love freely given. "Welcome home, Maggie," Annie whispered to her daughter. "Welcome to our family." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. But inside, warmed by fire and love and new life, Annie had never felt more certain that she was exactly where she belonged. The spare daughter had become the essential heart of a family built not on obligation but on choice, and that made all the difference. 5 years had passed since Maggie's birth, and the ranch had prospered beyond anything Annie could have imagined when she first arrived as a uncertain bride. The summer of 1882 had been especially kind, bringing abundant rain that turned the valley into a paradise of green grass and wildflowers. Annie stood on the porch, watching Maggie chase butterflies through the garden, her dark hair flying behind her like a banner. "Mama, look," Maggie called, holding up a handful of black-eyed Susans. "For the table." "Beautiful, sweetheart," Annie called back. "Bring them here and we'll put them in water." The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Jessie and John were returning from checking the far pastures, but they weren't alone. A third rider accompanied them, and as they drew closer, Annie recognized Samuel Grant, the young cowboy who had helped her during her journey west all those years ago. "Mrs. Hartland." Sam tipped his hat as he dismounted. "You're looking well." "Sam Grant." Annie smiled warmly. "It's been too long. What brings you to our valley?" Sam's weathered face creased in a grin. "Actually, I've got a proposition for Jessie. But first, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small wooden horse. "Heard you had a little one now." Maggie, suddenly shy, peeked out from behind Annie's skirts. Jesse swung down from his horse and scooped his daughter up. "Maggie, this is Mr. Grant. He helped your mama when she was traveling to find me." "Thank you," Maggie whispered, accepting the toy with wide eyes. Over dinner, Sam revealed his purpose. "I'm heading up to Montana Territory. There's good land opening up for homesteading, and I've saved enough to start my own spread. Thing is, I need partners I can trust. Thought maybe John might be interested." Annie felt her heart sink. John Standing Bear had become such an integral part of their lives, grandfather to Maggie, brother to Jesse, friend to her. The thought of losing him was painful. John was quiet for a long moment, then spoke. "This is my home. My family is here. But," he looked at Sam thoughtfully, "my nephew, Joseph Young Eagle, has been writing. He's leaving the reservation, looking for work. Good with horses, better with cattle. If Jesse's willing, perhaps he could take my place here while I help you get established. Few months, maybe through the winter." Jesse nodded slowly. "Family helps family, if you vouch for him. John, he's welcome here." The conversation turned to logistics, but Annie noticed how Maggie had crept into John's lap, clutching her new toy horse. The little girl adored her grandfather John, as she called him, and his absence, even temporary, would be hard. Later that evening, as Annie tucked Maggie into bed, her daughter asked, "Why does Grandfather John have to go away?" "He's helping a friend," Annie explained. "Sometimes that's what we do. We help people find their own homes, their own families." "Like you helped Aunt Eleanor." Annie was surprised. They rarely spoke of Eleanor, though they exchanged letters at Christmas. "How do you know about that?" "Papa told me. He said Aunt Eleanor was lost, but you helped her find her way." "I suppose I did," Annie said softly. "And now she helps other young women find their ways too." "When I grow up," Maggie announced, "I want to help people like you and Papa do." Annie kissed her daughter's forehead. "I'm sure you will, my love. Now sleep." The preparations for John's departure took 2 weeks. During that time, Joseph Young Eagle arrived, a quiet young man of 20 with John's steady demeanor and careful ways. Jesse took him out to work the cattle, and within days it was clear he would do well. The night before John left, they held a farewell dinner. Elizabeth and George Custer came, along with other neighbors who had come to respect the quiet Arapaho man who had made a home at the Heartland Ranch. Maggie refused to leave John's side, as if her presence could keep him there. "You'll write?" Annie asked as she helped John pack his few belongings. "When I can, you'll watch over Jesse." "As he watches over me," Annie assured him. "This will always be your home, John, always." "I know." He paused, then pulled something from his pack, a small leather pouch on a cord. "For Maggie. When she's older, it was my sister's protection for the journey of life." Annie's eyes misted. "She'll treasure it." The morning of departure dawned clear and bright. John said his goodbyes quietly, saving the longest for Maggie, who clung to him with fierce determination. "I'll be back," he promised. "And you be good for your mama and papa?" "I will," Maggie whispered. "I love you, Grandfather John." "Love you too, little warrior." Then he was gone, riding north with Sam Grant toward new adventures. The ranch felt emptier without him, though Joseph proved to be a worthy replacement, quiet, competent, and gentle with Maggie, who decided he would be Uncle Joseph within a week. As summer turned to autumn, a drought began, not severe at first, just a worrying lack of rain. The grass turned brown earlier than usual, and Jesse spent long days moving the cattle to find better grazing. "We've seen worse," he told Annie one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "The creek's still running. We'll manage." But the drought deepened as winter approached. The creek slowed to a trickle, and Jesse had to sell off some cattle earlier than planned to reduce the strain on the land. Other ranchers were struggling too. The Custers had already sold half their herd. "Maybe we should consider Montana too," George said during one of his visits. "Sam Grant writes that the grass is still green up there." Jesse shook his head. "This is our home. We've weathered storms before. We'll weather this." Annie admired his determination, but she could see the strain in the lines around his eyes, the way he studied the sky each morning hoping for clouds. She did what she could, stretching their supplies, maintaining the vegetable garden with careful water management, keeping spirits up. One evening in late February, as they huddled around the fire while wind howled outside, Maggie asked, "Are we poor now, Papa?" Jesse pulled his daughter close. "No, sweetheart. We have our home, our family, food to eat. That makes us rich in ways that matter." "Your father's right," Annie added. "When I first came here, I had nothing but hope. Now look what we've built together." "Tell me the story," Maggie demanded. "About how you came to marry Papa." It had become a favorite bedtime story, carefully edited for young ears. Annie told of the long journey, the storm, the moment she told Jesse the truth. Maggie always giggled at the part where Jesse couldn't find words, tongue-tied by Annie's honesty. "And then you fell in love," Maggie concluded happily. "And then we fell in love." Jesse agreed, his eyes meeting Annie's over their daughter's head. That night, as if their love story had summoned it, rain began to fall, softly at first, then steadier, until it was a proper soaking rain that would penetrate deep into the earth. Annie woke to the sound and found Jesse already at the window, watching with wonder. "It's raining," he said unnecessarily. "I hear it." Annie laughed, joining him. They stood together, watching the water stream down, bringing life back to their land. By morning, puddles had formed everywhere, and the creek ran fuller than it had in months. Maggie splashed through every puddle she could find, shrieking with delight, while Annie didn't have the heart to scold her for muddying her dress. The rain continued off and on for a week, not flooding but steady, nurturing. The grass began to green, and Jesse's shoulders lost their tension. They had survived another test. A letter arrived from John as spring took hold. He had helped Sam establish his ranch and would return by summer. He wrote of Montana's beauty, but concluded, "It's not home. Home is where family waits." Eleanor wrote too, sending a photograph of herself with her latest class of graduates. 20 young women going out into the world prepared for more than just marriage, she wrote. "Though I hope they find love like you did, the kind built on truth and partnership." As Annie prepared for John's return, she realized how their definition of family had expanded and evolved. It wasn't just blood, it was choice, commitment, shared struggles, and joy. It was Jesse, steady and true. It was Maggie, bright and loving. It was John, who had chosen them as they had chosen him. It was Joseph, earning his place through quiet dedication. It was even Eleanor, finding her own path but staying connected through letters and love. The day John returned, riding in just as the sun touched the mountain peaks, Maggie nearly knocked him over with the force of her embrace. "Grandfather John, I kept your seat at the table, and Uncle Joseph taught me to track rabbits, and Papa says the cattle are fat again, and Mama's having another baby." That last bit of news, which Annie had planned to share more privately, made everyone freeze for a moment. Then John's weathered face split into a huge grin. "Another little one. This family just keeps growing." That evening, they all gathered for dinner: Jesse, Annie, Maggie, John, and Joseph, who had chosen to stay on despite John's return. The table that had once seemed too large for two now barely contained them all, filled with food, laughter, and love. To family. Jesse raised his glass of water. They saved whiskey for special occasions. "However it comes to us." "To family," they echoed. Outside, The sun set in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, just as Jesse had described in those long-ago letters. But he had been wrong about one thing: it wasn't better shared. It was only complete when shared, just as they were only complete together. Annie looked around the table at the faces she loved: her husband, her daughter, her chosen brothers, and felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. She had traveled so far from that frightened girl boarding a stage in Missouri, convinced she was nobody's first choice. Now she knew better. She was Annie McAllister Hartland, wife, mother, partner, friend. She had carved out a life in this wild land through courage, honesty, and love. She had learned that sometimes what seems like second best turns out to be exactly right. That love isn't in pretty words, but in daily choices. That family isn't just what you're born to, but what you build. The virgin lips that had stayed silent for so long, afraid to speak her truth, now spoke freely of love, hope, and home, and the body that had revealed that truth through hard work, through tenderness, through the children she bore, continued to build the life she had once only dreamed of. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Maggie yawned and curled into John's lap. Soon there would be another child at this table, and someday, perhaps, grandchildren. The ranch would continue to grow and prosper, weathering whatever storms came, because they would weather them together. "Penny, for your thoughts," Jesse murmured, his hand finding hers under the table. "Just thinking how glad I am that Eleanor refused you," Annie said with a smile, "and that my parents sent the right daughter after all, even if they didn't know it." "The only daughter I ever wanted," Jessie corrected, lifting her hand to kiss it. And in that simple gesture was everything: choice, commitment, partnership, love. Not the love of fairy tales or romantic letters, but something better, stronger, more real. The love of two people who had seen each other's worst and chose to build something beautiful anyway. The love that had transformed a spare daughter into the heart of a home. The love that proved, in the end, that truth spoken bravely could lead to happiness beyond imagining. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Annie and Jesse's journey. If you enjoyed their tale of courage, love, and finding family in unexpected places, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Leave a comment below, and let's share our thoughts about this Wild West romance. Please consider subscribing to Wild West Stories 1850 for more tales of frontier life, love, and adventure. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and press the hype button to help more people discover Annie's inspiring journey from invisible daughter to beloved wife and mother. Your support helps these stories reach others who love tales of the American frontier.